Hello Hughes History students with Mr. Howe, and this is our next installment of our YouTube videos about our 8th grade early American history class, and so I welcome you back. Today is the last section in chapter 13, so as we get to the last section that means that, well, there's a test coming up pretty soon. And next week there will be a test assigned probably on Monday or Tuesday or both days. So be prepared for that. But before we get there, let's start going over chapter 13, section 4. It's about the California Gold Rush. So if you had a really good 4th grade elementary school teacher, you probably learned a little bit about the California Gold Rush then. So a lot of this stuff might sound familiar. Before we get to the actual stuff in the chapter, let's talk about some goals and objectives that I have for you by doing the section assessment and learning about the California Gold Rush. So let's take a look, as we always do, about what the objectives are and what I'd like you to be able to do after completing the section assessment and watching this YouTube lesson. The main objective is to demonstrate an understanding of how gold was found in California and why thousands rushed to California to make it a state so quickly. The proving behavior will be, can you identify 3 things we have today as a result of the gold rush to California? We'll especially talk about those 3 things when we get to the end of the video today. Why it matters today. The gold rush made California grow rapidly and helped bring about California's cultural diversity. In the chapter it talks about how many different people who weren't in California at the time rushed to California in order to capitalize on the gold rush. And the connection to today. California is the biggest populated state in the United States. The wealth of the state economy, its political power in the House, and its diversity make California one of the most important states in the Union. And so before we get to the actual lesson 2, I'd like to go over with you the map from the previous lesson. On Monday you were asked, or Monday or Tuesday, you were asked to work on a map showing some of the big events of the Mexican War. So now let's take a look at that map. There should be stuff on the front and the back. So here's what your map from the assignment on Monday or Tuesday should look like. Just kind of gives you an idea of some of the important leaders in this war. We know that President Polk was the president in this war that kind of instigated the war, but here's the area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande that we were talking about. You should have that kind of shaded and labeled as disputed territory. Here's where Polk ordered the troops to be sent in order to get the Mexicans mad enough to get them to attack, which they did. And of course that gave Polk the reasoning that he thought he needed to ask Congress to declare war, and he got what he wanted. So the rest of the map, this would be a great time for you to pause the map. It does need to have a key showing American troop movements, American victory, Mexican victories, and have a couple of places labeled on here. Some of the important generals: Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott, not a general but a leader, Stephen Kearny, Fremont, John C. Fremont, Robert Stockton. You might recognize some of those places in California. There are cities called Stockton, named after Robert Stockton and Kearny and Fremont. So they were so important in California history that they have their names immortalized. And of course they called California's part of this war the Bear Flag Revolution. So once again, pause right here. And this would be a great time to make sure you have the front of your map finished. And as soon as you do that, look on the back of your map, because I'm going to show you what should be on the back of your map as well. On the back of your map, you should have a section that shows the causes of the Mexican War, and then another section that talks about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what the United States gained and what Mexico lost as a result of this this war called the Mexican War, or the Mexican-American War. It certainly was a disaster for Mexico. They lost about 1/3 of their country when they lost to the United States in this war and agreed to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Once again, great time to pause, check the back of your map. And when you turn this in, don't forget you're going to be taking 2 pictures if you're going to send this to me using photos. You're going to take a picture of the front, you're going to take a picture of the back, and that's how you'll get full credit for doing this map. So before we get into the chapter studies, just to kind of give you the big picture of what it'll look like, don't forget this is the area called the Mexican Cession. That was part of that settlement in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed by Mexico after the war to get the United States to leave Mexico City and make this war, get this war over. And the part that we're focusing on today, of course, is our home state of California. Lovely place to live. And it was going to be mostly in the northern area that the population will come to as far as the gold rush. And that's why San Francisco is the major port of entry for the 49ers as they were coming in by ocean, either around South America, or if they took the partway across the ocean to Panama, then crossed Panama, then got on another boat, but they would usually enter in through San Francisco regardless. So that's one of the reasons why San Francisco becomes such a big city at the time, and why today their National Football League team is called the 49ers. So now let's get right into the chapter and take a look at some of the ideas, pictures, photographs, paintings that we can see in chapter 13, section 4. So now we're ready to go over the chapter and take a look at some of the text and some of the photographs and some of the paintings. One of the cool things about this time period that we're studying is, and we've talked about it before a little bit, but just to kind of review it, prior to the 1840s, there were hardly any photographs because photography just had not been refined to the point where it could be used. I think the earliest photographs were in the late 1820s. But by the 1840s, photography had become a new art form. And so as we continue on for the school year studying some of these things, we'll be not only relying on drawings and paintings that were made at the time, we'll actually be able to see some actual photographs of some of the history that we're talking about. And that helps to make it a little bit more interesting. The chapter starts on page 412 where it says California Gold Rush, and true to what I just said, there's a photograph of a woman carrying food and probably selling food to the miners. A lot of women found out that mining was very hard work and wasn't something they wanted to do, but if you could cook, if you could clean, if you could make things that the miners wanted, then there were a lot of economic opportunities other than the actual mining. And the woman carrying food and selling food to the miners probably was making a pretty good living because they still had to eat. And so the miners were willing to give up some of the gold they were able to find in order to get food. The first section of actual text, though, talks about the Californios, which is the name that they used to describe first the Spanish, later the Mexican settlers who were there after the Indians, of course. In Texas, they were called Tejanos. In California, they were called Californios. And it mentions one in particular, Mariano Vallejo, who ends up, who has kind of a sad ending by the end of this. But, you know, before California was part of the United States, he was a wealthy landowner, 250,000 acres of land. That's a lot of land in Northern California. So his story is going to be part of this kind of the sad parts of what happens to a lot of Mexican Americans during the gold rush. It talks about on the next page, on page 413, it talks about the rush for gold that starts when John Sutter, who was a Swiss immigrant into Mexico, petitions for land from then government of Mexico, gets it, and then one of his employees, James Marshall, discovers gold in one of the areas that was given to John Sutter. And John Sutter wasn't real happy about this because the last thing he wanted was, you know, hundreds and thousands of miners coming in, going and trampling his agricultural fields looking for gold. So they tried to keep it a secret. but you just can't keep things like that a secret, and pretty much word gets out, and you have this rush to California, which is why it's called a gold rush. So in the next section on page 412, it talks about the rush for gold. 413, and it talks about the ways that you could get. And there's an interesting painting of an advertisement showing if you were to get on board of this ship on the East Coast, it would only take 119 days, or I'm sorry, 112 days to get to San Francisco. That's a long time to be on a ship, to have to sail from the East Coast around South America to get to San Francisco. But people were so willing to believe that all they have to do is to get to California and dig for a little gold to get their fortune. A lot of them were willing to do that. So in this, on page 413, it talks about the three basic ways you could go. You could sail the 18,000 miles in over 100 days on the sea to get there. Some people kind of made it a combination sea, land, sea by sailing to Panama, crossing Panama, which probably took you about a month, maybe less than a month. Then get on board another ship on the other side of Panama on the Pacific Ocean, and then sail to San Francisco from there. And then there was the traveling across land, like most of the pioneers did at the time, leaving from Independence, or Mormons left from Nauvoo, and going across the United States by land. So three very long and dangerous trips in order to get from the East Coast to the West Coast in order to get the gold in California. But people were willing to do it. They were so sure of the fact that they were going to find gold and get rich, they were willing to do that. So go on and go to page 414. It talks about Levi's. And of course, a lot of people like to wear Levi's, and it gets its start during this gold rush period because a man named Levi Strauss, who went originally to find gold but was not lucky finding gold. He did come up with a moneymaker, though, by selling these very tough, strong pants that were made out of the sails of sailing ships. And that being the case, they were tough pants, the strong fabric, and today the Levi Strauss Company is a multi-billion-dollar company that sells pants around the world, but gets its start during the gold rush times. So in this page it talks about the mining camps, how dangerous they could be, how you could lose your money gambling, you could lose your money by being robbed or killed. But then at the bottom of page 414, one of the effects of the gold rush is the cultural diversity in California, because you have people coming from around the world, besides the mostly white Americans, but also some African Americans coming from the east and the south to get rich in California. You also had people from Mexico that didn't already live in California move to California because they too wanted to get rich. And also you have the first large number of Asian people moving to California during the gold rush, and mostly from China. Things were not going so well in China, so they thought they could cross the ocean and get rich in California. Lot of discrimination against the Chinese, and so most of the Chinese were forced not to be miners and were forced back into working in the towns, but there they established successful businesses. And so a lot of Chinese people can say that, you know, we've been in the United States going back to the 1840s. And so if you do your family history and you happen to find out that you have Chinese ancestry, it's quite possible a lot of the Chinese were in California at the gold rush time. So maybe we can refer to them as original immigrants during the gold rush in a way. Then on the next page, page 415, it talks about surface mining and what you had to do. A lot of kids have told me in the past that they've gone to Knott's Berry Farm, and they've when they were in 4th grade, and they did some panning for gold at Knott's Berry Farm. So that's part of the experience and knowing what it was like. Not a very easy way to get gold, but some were very successful at it. And then on the last page, no, not quite the last page, page 416, it talked about conflicts among the miners and how the Chinese were eventually forced away from the mining fields. It talks about the impact of the gold rush, and it's part of the reason why California became a state so quickly was because so many people rushed to California. And at the bottom of page 416, I'd like you to pay special attention to that chart showing cause and effect. As a history student, you have to understand that, you know, there's a couple different ways to look at cause and effect. This is more of a simplistic way, having an event called a cause something to happen called the effect. And that's one way to look at it. A lot of times people like to look at it as you have an event that has causes and then you have effects. So there's different ways to look at it. But take a look at that chart because it does talk about how some things can be looked at. This happened and so it caused this effect. So that's on that chart on page 416. And then finally at the very end it brings back the same guy that it talked about at the beginning of the reading, Mariano Vallejo. Who unfortunately, because of unfair land claims made by the people moving west, his land shrunk from about 250,000 acres to about 3,000 acres. Oh, pardon me, even worse than that, 300 acres. So it's one of those sad facts about American history is that a lot of claims that were made by Spanish who became Mexicans when Mexico became its own country, then became Mexican Americans when the land was ceded to the United States as part of the Mexican-American settlement and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. A lot of them unfairly lost their land as white Americans moved west and were able to successfully take the land away. So at that point, there are some interesting stories in here for a lot of people. California was like a place to have a dream and to build something. It talks about a couple of African American women who, you know, were regarded as slaves or second-class citizens wherever they lived in the East, but moved west and were able to get their own land, start businesses, and become very successful. So now at the very bottom of that page you have the section 4 section assessment, 6 terms you had to explain the significance of. You skipped the using graphics, don't forget, and then 3 main idea questions, and hopefully you were brave enough to try the critical thinking question. So now let's go over what you read and what you learned about when you did the terms and names, main ideas, and critical thinking. So now that I've given you a chance to go over and read the section assessment, you're supposed to have completed the terms and names and the main ideas and hopefully the critical thinking question and answer. And now we've gone over the chapter together. So let's take a look at your terms and names, and you can add a few ideas. You can fix your answers if you think they need a little bit of fixing. Talks about the terms and names, 49ers. We learned about the Californios. And an example of Californio Mariano Vallejo. John Sutter and James Marshall, of course, are connected to the California Gold Rush. So take a look at those terms, and this would be an excellent time to pause and make sure that your terms and names pretty much go with what these terms and names say on your terms and names as well. Now, as most of you know, we also have something that is not in the chapter itself, and so this is my evidence that you're supposed to have watched this YouTube video and learned a little bit from it. And my evidence is going to be this bubble map showing the effects of the California Gold Rush. So this would be a great time to pause and to add this bubble map. One of them was kind of done for you. It says in this one circle, it says miners come from around the world. And I added to it 250,000, quote, rushed, end quote, to California to get the gold. At the time, only 60,000 people were required to be inside of a territory before it could become a state. So very quickly, California gets what it needs in terms of population to have a state. Then on this side, on the right side again, this bubble map should say California becomes a state San Francisco becomes a major city, and those would all be kind of positive effects of the California Gold Rush. On the left-hand side, bubbles, not so positive. Many Californios, which were the original inhabitants, well, actually the Spanish inhabitants and later Mexican inhabitants, they lost most or all of their land. A lot of unfair treatment of the Californios. And then down here on this bubble here, thousands of Native Americans die of disease. Many are hunted down and killed by the miners called the 49ers. So those are some positive and negative effects of the California Gold Rush. Now let's take a look. Oh, once again, pause. Make sure you have this on your paper, because if I don't see it, I can't give you full credit. And now let's go ahead and go to the main idea questions. So here are the main ideas that go over what we learned when we went over the chapter, and hopefully you wrote down some good ideas on your own when you completed the section assessment before this. Letter A says, how did the California Gold Rush get started? And a good idea for an answer might be, in 1848, gold was discovered in Northern California on land owned by John Sutter. He was from Switzerland. When word got to the eastern U.S. in 1849, it set off a rush to get there first to get the gold, and led to the name 49ers to describe these people rushing to California. And if you're a big fan of NFL football, that is where the term comes from, by calling the team that plays in San Francisco. I think they play in San Jose now, but they're still called the San Francisco 49ers. Letter B asks the question, why didn't many 49ers become rich? And gold was not as easy to mine as it was described. Prices for basic supplies were very high, the crime rate was very high, and many died of disease and living in poor conditions. So the vast majority of 49ers did not become rich from gold mining. Although some people did become rich by selling supplies. You might, in the reading it talked about Levi Strauss, don't forget, who gets the idea of building tough, strong pants out of the material they used for sails on sailing ships. So, and of course, these pants become known as Levi's because of Levi Strauss, a company still around. It's a multi-billion-dollar company today. Letter C, how did women and people of different racial, ethnic, and national groups contribute to the California Gold Rush? This would be a good way to kind of, draw in the idea of the multicultural part of California. The gold rush started on land owned by a Swiss man, that's John Sutter. Miners from Mexico brought new tools and technical skills. Chinese miners, when forced from mining, opened businesses. Women opened businesses and sold supplies. So you did have the contributions of a lot of different racial, ethnic, and other national groups coming to California besides the white Americans who we refer to as the 49ers. And finally, critical thinking. What are some of the effects of the California Gold Rush? With all the people, quote, rushing, end quote, to it, California became a state very quickly in 1850, only 2 years after being taken from Mexico. San Francisco became a major city and a center of business and culture. Going west became symbolic of the American dream of land ownership, riches, success, hopes for a fresh start and a better life. And California is one of those states that's always been kind of symbolic of people moving west in hopes for success and a better life. Go ahead and pause if you need to and write down anything that you're missing on your answers. So what can we say about the California Gold Rush and the 49ers? There's a lot of good things we can talk about. We can talk about how the California Gold Rush caused California to become a state very, very quickly. So many people rushed to California in 1849 and 1850 that by 1850 they had enough people there to apply to become a state. And sure enough, 1850 is the year that California becomes a state. Compare that with another state from the Mexican cession, Arizona. It took Arizona 60 years to get enough people to move to Arizona in order for Arizona to petition to become a state. California takes less than 2. Let's talk about some of the ideals of California that are established by the gold rush. The fact that we're called the Golden State. The idea of gone to California as a way to try to get away and get off to a fresh start. The idea of California dreaming. That's all some of the positive ideas of the California gold rush. Another thing about the ideals of California is how culturally diverse that we are as a result of the gold rush. Besides the white Americans coming from the eastern part of the country, you had Mexican Americans, you had Mexican miners in Mexico that left Mexico to go to California. Of course, you always have the Native Americans there as part of the cultural diversity. For the first time in U.S. history, too, you have a large number of Asians. Chinese people came over in great number and started places in California that are still around today. The famous Chinatowns in San Francisco and Los Angeles get started as a result of the California gold rush. Secondly, you have the problem or not really a problem, but the issue of the 49ers. And I brought up the word problem a second ago because they are kind of problematic. As we've learned about history, it matters who writes the history and when the history is written. For a long time, the 49ers were written about in history as brave, ambitious pioneers that were tough and strong and came over and established towns and mining camps and things like that. But one of the things that was often left out of the history books until recently is the fact that thousands of Native Americans were murdered and hunted down by a lot of these 49ers / miners who saw the Indians as being in their way. We have a professional football team in San Francisco named the 49ers because San Francisco was the main port that many of the 49ers came into. Most of you might know that I went to a university called Cal State University Long Beach, and their mascot for a long time was the 49ers, not only because of the miners of California and the gold rush, but also because the college was started in 1949. But about 5 years ago, a lot of students on the campus at Long Beach State weren't quite sure, because of the recent evidence of the hunting down and murdering of Native Americans by many 49ers, if it was appropriate to keep that name as a mascot and to call their teams the Long Beach State 49ers, which is one of the reasons they changed the name from the 49ers to the Sharks. So it goes to show you that the 49ers have become a problematic part in history as far as what their place is. They were there, they did what they did, but is it really appropriate to have a university that celebrates the 49ers? Apparently, most students on the campus of Long Beach State thought it wasn't appropriate to keep calling their mascot the 49ers. And thirdly, the addition of California as a state because of the gold rush has an impact on what happens next in our country's history as far as the big effects, and that is the fact that there's a civil war. When California became a free state in 1850, a lot of Southerners were saying, well, that's not fair. That gives California an advantage of having 2 more senators in the Senate, and they can outvote the Southern senators when it came to issues about slavery. To make the Southerners feel better, the National Congress also added a fugitive slave law, which made it illegal for Northerners to help escaped slaves get further north. And that's going to cause a lot of controversy, and many people think that's part of the reason why the Civil War happened when it happened, in regards to why so many people were upset that the national government seemed to be helping Southerners recover their escaped slaves when they saw slavery as something wrong and as a sin. That does it for this chapter. Chapter 13, Section 4 is the last chapter. Be prepared for a Chapter 13 test next week, and I'll see you next time.